I'd like to thank both of our speakers. I think it was fantastic to hear both from history and from a current dispute. And obviously we're talking about the role of women in the labour movement, although the discussion doesn't have to be restricted to that. But I think these examples show that sometimes women have more to fight for than necessarily male workers, because of the other layers of oppression that we face, and particularly with the Grunwick Strike, the layer of racism and the fact that these were migrant workers as well, but that by unifying with other sections of the working class and white male miners, you know, who saw instinctively, after the appeal that was made by the strikers at Grunwick, the need for solidarity across class, rather than allowing the divisions on race and gender to be used by the ruling class to divide the working class, would ultimately weaken all disputes, not just the Grunwick one. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned from these disputes. So
I'd like to feel out the first one in, but anyway. Thank you to both of you for really good speeches. Just on a comment about the UCU strike, really inspiring action, and the scale of the involvement of the membership is incredible. You know, having 150 to 200 pickets each day on the picket line for 14 days of action in sub-zero temperatures a lot of the time is an incredible achievement. Even reinstating the idea of having burning braziers on the picket line, which is something that's disappeared from the picket lines apart from the firefighters, who no one can stop. But, you know, I mean, I think that's symbolic, actually, of re-establishing some traditions of the trade union movement that existed in the past and perhaps have disappeared for a while. And I think it shows that struggle in the future, people come up with new ideas and new approaches and new methods and new ways of doing it, but some of the old ways of doing it that worked will also be reinstated as well. And I think that's an example of that. And I was there on the International Women's Day. It was great fun marching around the campus, renaming the buildings, fantastic. The Social Sciences block, it was renamed the Alexandra Kollontai building after the Russian Revolutionary. And the Ken Edwards building was renamed Jayabin Desai building, which is a very appropriate way of choosing to get up and say, oh, there's this play on next week. All fitted together. So, you know, that was brilliant. But also, some of you have already heard my during the war stories, but my anecdotes. But I was, like Jean, I went down to the Grunwick picket lines at the time. I was a very young lad, I hasten to say, at the time, honest. It was the first big political event I'd ever been to in my life, and it had a massive impact on me and my understanding of what was going on. I was there when basically, you know, there were tens of thousands of workers surrounding the factory and all the streets around where the factory was, and there was that block for that period of time where the workers controlled the area. There was genuine working class control of the area, and it, you know, it gave me that sense of, Jesus, you know, workers can control things. It gives that sense of power, and also to see, you know, the postal workers march down to join the picket lines, and then the Yorkshire miners marching down almost like a military formation behind their banner with Arthur Scargan at the front. By the way, both those sections of workers, as Jean said, had just had recent strikes. The postal workers had been out on strike in 1971. And I tell you what, the lessons they learned from that, for many, many decades after that, the one group of workers you knew would not cross a picket line were the postal workers, because of their experience in 1971 that they'd learned. And then obviously the miners have been out on strike in 72 and 74. And just that feeling. Also, the police tried to break through the lines very seriously and failed. And I didn't really intend to be, but I ended up in the front line, literally second row. This is my story. Sorry. The second row, right? all these Yorkshire miners around me, sort of like arms linked. Come on lads, link arms. It's like my feet barely touching the floor. You know what I mean? These great big burly Yorkshire miners around me. And the police obviously started charging towards us. And there was, you know, hundreds of people blocking the road. And I just thought that, I thought I'm going to die. Just honestly. And, you know, the reaction is to try and run away, but you couldn't because there was just a solid mass of these miners. And they called off the police charge at the last minute. And they literally, the police all, I remember the hooves scraping on the road as the horses were trying to stop before they reached the demonstration. So they actually failed. I was very elated afterwards, but I tell you what, at the time I was shitting myself. But I mean, all of that, it's just a practical lesson, workers' strength and workers' power. But that was sold out by the TUC leaders, as Jean said. But you know, it was a lesson, and it was obviously a key turning point in the trade union movement in Britain. There'd been a continual growth in the trade union movement through the 60s and 70s, till the point where it became very, very powerful. The majority of people at work in the country were trade union members. And if you add their families to that, the majority of society were linked to the trade union movement. Really powerful movement. And it was growing in militancy as well throughout the 70s. There was increasing militancy of those trade unions. The ruling class in this country were terrified of the power of the trade unions and of the working class. That's why the National Association for Freedom, backed by people like the McWhirters, who owned Guinness Book of Records, very reactionary, rich, big businessmen, tried to smash this strike because they thought it would be a turning point. But the other aspects, well, apart from the aspects of the role of women in the strike coming to the fore, but also it was the role of migrant workers in the trade union movement. Sorry, a couple of years before what happened to Grunwick's, there was a strike in Leicester, because obviously Leicester took a large chunk of the Ugandan, East African Asians who came to Britain. A lot of them settled in Leicester. And there was a strike in the Imperial Typewriters factory. Imperial Typewriters, a very appropriate factory on East Park Road in Highfields. And it was a strike that was divided on race lines because the white shop stewards in the factory didn't back the strike, and the Asian workers were on strike on the picket line and the white workers stayed in. So that showed a really potentially dangerous division. And this was the time when the National Front was strong in Leicester, for example. The headquarters of the NF was in Leicester. So it was a really big warning. But by the time the Grunwicks took place, it showed that the trade union movement had realised as a whole that they had to stand side by side with migrant workers if the trade union movement wasn't to get divided and defeated along those lines. So it was a really important turning point from that point of view as well. Last point I wanted to make, I think the UCU proved that the anti-union laws that various Tory governments have brought in and Labour governments haven't repealed can be defeated. You know, they can backfire on them. The issue of the ballot and the work that the unions have to now do to get past that threshold, and also the fact there's a time limit on how long you've got before you take strike action. So this idea that you can call a one-day strike and then 6 months later maybe have another one-day strike, that's out of the window now, because by then you'd have to reballot. So you might as well concentrate your strike action and do it all at once, and that's actually will rebound on the Tories. But the whole point about secondary picketing and all the anti-union laws, they can be smashed. The main problem has not been the anti-union laws, it's been the trade union leaders who've not been prepared to defy them. Because unless unions had defied the law in the first place, they wouldn't even exist. So, you know, there are times when the trade union movement's got to say, sod the law, we're coming out on strike, and there's many examples where workers have taken action and the law has been irrelevant because of the strength of the working class. Sorry.
That there's a need for everything, because if you don't see a mass sort of, looking for the word, a mass connection of everyone, then those people that are there to kind of, who've got the influence to actually change those laws, won't do it. because ultimately, you know, we see that there are a lot of politicians that are just influenced by the popular and influenced by the chance of having voters on board. So there is that need for people, and ordinary people, to show that this is what we want to happen. And I think that maybe it's not always by playing by those rules, because we know that if you play by the capitalist rules, they're very, very good, aren't they? They know what they're doing, they know everything in the capitalist world. So if we veer towards those rules, that ends up in compromise rather than actually changing anything. You do end up the risk of actually compromising to work within their rules, when clearly if you have a set of principles and you have a set of rules, well, not rules, but you have a set of goals that you want to go by, I think it's important that you keep those goals and then don't veer towards changing them, so that you can then put yourself in a system that you're fighting against.
Law that says you can't walk out on your employer. Yeah, people are pressurised more now, like they've got the mortgage and what have you. But I'd like to state that, yeah, it's not just Parliament. We do have councillors that actually are supposed to be there to protect, or we've got the Lady Council in Leicester, who are actually more like a Tory council, that actually, if I remember, during the miners' strike, were helping the law actually to implement the destruction of the NUN. That's all I can remember at the time about that. But we have to learn by the past and what has happened in the past. There's an election next year, and yes, guess who's going to be coming round to me and you? Yeah, no matter who we are, or you know, no matter we're female or male, we're going to have to face this fact that, like, you know, that, well, if you want our vote, and this is what we should be putting out now, you want our vote, then you've got to support the ordinary people, and that means ordinary people in trade unionism, and you know, like, you know, taking it from a different perspective. You know, there's a lot of issues around that. That's opening up as a council and what have you. But there's no support on councils for trade unionism. You don't hear about it anymore. You don't hear about trade unionism connected with the local authorities in any kind of way. I've got a question about this. How can we link one with the other? How can we strengthen the need? Well, should I say that, like, how can we actually to ordinary people, you need a trade union, and you also actually have to have a council. Both of these things, they're both relevant more now than ever. We've got issues coming up, universal credits, you know, I'm helping people personally with that kind of thing. There are massive issues, more relevant now than it was 30 years ago in the miners' strike, because there are more people suffering under the economic situation, you know, as we are now. We're still recovering from the 2008 downturn, the complete collapse almost of like the economy. We're still recovering from that. People don't see it like that. Of course, I would like to basically put that question: how do we actually learn from the past? How do we strengthen our unions within our local government?
Yeah, I was just, I guess, by a couple of going to come back on Oliver's question, because I think it's a really important issue, because as socialists, obviously, we fight for trade union recognition, for workers' rights, to improve people's sort of basic terms and conditions. But we don't see necessarily the trade unions being just it's an essential ingredient, but it's not the whole picture. They're always at the same time we're fighting for political alternatives as well, which is what I think is key, really, because obviously, like, we've had some good news recently with Amy Murphy. He's one of the Socialist Party member that recently got elected as the president of USDOR, which is a shop workers union with 500,000 people in it. It's a massive step forward, and we do similar stuff in other trade unions as well. We fight to take the leadership. quite notoriously in unison. We had Roger Bannister standing against Dave Prentice a few years ago. Dave Prentice won it, but it was a campaign that was mired in corruption because he used all the forces of the union illegally to try and stop Roger from becoming the secretary, and it was quite close in the end. But the point is, though, that we do that, but it's a multi-pronged thing, that we also fight for a political alternative, and that at the moment is Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party, for obvious reasons, because he's said, obviously he supports policies such as overturning the anti-trade union laws, but also I guess we probably go beyond that as well, that we would support Jeremy Corbyn in his position at the moment, but the political alternative that we fight for is within our own party as well. So ultimately, to sort of transform society fully, we see the need for a party to do that.
Hearing all this information, what I can't help but realise is that it seems that the trade unions can't be trusted. It seems like when you look at the leadership on top, it seems that throughout the decades the government has installed its tactics and its techniques to get the right people where they want in the trade union, and because of it I feel like the trade union isn't a value as good as a tool as it is. It's not a tool that was as good as it used to be. So again, it's a feeling of kind of stuck. You know, we want to use these institutions to help us, but it seems like these institutions are being turned against us. So what do we do? Like, that's all I can do. I just shook my shoulders, tried to think, how did it get to this mess? And really, it's just the same old capitalism again, isn't it? You know, they install who they need in where they need, and they turn the institution in on itself, and by the time we know it, it feels as though these trade unions aren't very much for the people. They're just to make sure that they maintain and stay alive, and therefore compromise all their norms and values. So where are we? That's my question. Like, what do we do from here?
You're not wrong.
One thing I saw recently on Facebook actually was our elected representative in America, Sarah Seaton. She was actually at SeaTac Airport in Seattle, and an employee of the airport came up to her and said, "I really admire what you're doing, it's fantastic. Worked for Alaska Airlines." And then someone else said, "Well, did you get him to join?" And he said, "Well, no, I couldn't, because he had to dash back to work. Because he would get reprimanded by his employer for talking politically when he should be doing his job." And that is a limitation of someone actually being able to stand up and just walk out of their job. We have that right, of course, and no one can stop you. But at the same time, if you do it on your own without the backing of a union, you're at the risk of losing your job ultimately. And that was a situation that obviously the employees at Grunwick must have found themselves in. They were being attacked racially. There was an atmosphere of racism, I understand, reading about the dispute at the plants. They were actually discouraging English people from taking the jobs when they were recruiting people to work there, just simply to undercut wages so they could get away with paying less. All they were fighting for was union recognition and the chance to actually have a say in the running of their own workforce, which isn't, you know, basic demands that trade unionists all fight for. It follows on, if you look at the context of the time as well, these demands we're still fighting for in many industries today. In Seattle, but we have got some political representation. Shams Want is now taking on Amazon there, and I'd be happy to fight against the brutal conditions in that workplace. And so therefore it hasn't changed at all, and the Tories will always try and sabotage workers' interests. They're always going to try to sabotage the power of the trade unions, be it legal means or by getting people they want in at the top. And this was actually, of course, Grunwick dispute was actually under a Labour government, but the Callaghan government, by no means perfect at all. And the Scarman report had some decent stuff in it, but it was ignored by the Tories. And of course, they came for the throats of the Labour movement as soon as they got in under Thatcher. And Blair, as people have said, the Blairites did nothing at all in the many years they were in power to actually change anything. Corbyn at least has said he would get rid of the anti-trade union laws and return to some fighting trade union. He's going to come under a huge amount of pressure himself if he gets in charge, not to do that. We see all the attacks from the press on Corbyn as it is, that only intensify. And he needs to get rid of the Blairites in the Labour Party and actually install some decent fighters on his side if he's going to win that battle, I think. The other point is we need a political alternative, and so the point's been made, as Tom said himself, the trade union movement can fight, and it is a very powerful weapon because we can withdraw our labour, which creates the profits for the bosses at the end of the day. But it needs to be hand in hand with a fighting political and a democratic political movement. That's what we're trying to build as a Socialist Party. So one of the ways I would suggest that people could begin to change things would be to join the Socialist Party.
Which I'm a member of, there's always massive campaigns to democratise it and to fight for a leadership that's actually reflective of the members of the union. Because usually, because we're in a capitalist society, and we haven't had socialism yet, a lot of the leaders of the trade unions do not necessarily reflect the members of their unions. And there's lots of reasons for that, but one of the reasons is because over a long period of quite a few decades now, there hasn't really been much of a struggle within the unions against capitalism, against society. And part of that is because the Labour movement itself, the Labour Party, moved sharply to the right. The leadership of it did anyway during the 1980s. And so, therefore, the unions haven't been winning battles, and so it's enabled careerists, effectively, to get into positions of power within not only trade unions, but also the Labour Party. And as that process has happened, so that process can be reversed. And now we're in a massive period of change, where Jeremy Corbyn, we have a socialist leader of a Labour Party, who's inspiring hundreds of thousands of people to get involved in politics once again. And so we can see things changing very, very quickly now. And so, in the same way that with the UCU strike, like, the leadership of the union tried to persuade the members, said they accepted a deal, and the members of the union said, no, we reject that offer. And so it's not that the UCU leadership is necessarily corrupt or useless, it's that they don't realise what the workers, the actual members of their union, really want and are going to demand. And so, as a result of grassroots pressure and votes that were taken within the union, the leadership had to change their position. But it shows the members of the union as well that things need to change in the union. Maybe they need different people at the very tops of their union. They've got good reps at a local level, but maybe some of those people can go on to more important positions within the Labour movement. And so, yeah, I think it is an ongoing struggle wherever we are, in whatever workplace you're in. I think you have to explore all routes for change, and the socialists, I think we do that, but quite often people are held back by whether that's your local Labour MP or a local trade union leader who try not to fight because they don't fundamentally believe that the working class, the 99.9% of us, can change society, and they think they can just make deals for us, act on our behalf, when actually we need to act on our own behalf to change the world.
Anti-poll tax movement, when the Socialist Party was still the militant inside the Labour Party, organising in the all British anti-poll tax union. When we advocated mass non-payment, but then when people didn't pay their poll tax, and over 17 million people did not pay their poll tax, but they would then be attempted to be imprisoned by the magistrates' courts. And so another tactic that we had on top of that was having cheat sheets with the kind of law around being a Mackenzie's friend, and kind of different ways that you could clog up the process going through the magistrates' courts to block people having to go before the court, to waste the court's time, and so on. So, you know, we can use all different kinds of tactics to fight. But where you do, and when you do see progression made in the law, usually it's because the mass movements and the trade union movement has come before that. So if you look at the Equal Pay Act, that came as a result of strike action taken by, women workers, female Ford Dagenham workers, fighting to get the equal pay as men. But even when that act came in, it did not mean equal pay for women, because what happened was that women workers then got graded and we paid them on different grades, and it just so happens to be all women are on one grade and all the men are on another grade. So you then had further strike action in Coventry to actually enforce the Equal Pay Act. So, and you can have examples today as well, like I used to work for the courts, and as a court clerk I saw a lot of injustice passed because of how the law works, and it does, under capitalism the reality is that the legal system is being run by people in the elite privileged positions in society, and it supports owners of private property because it supports this idea that the capitalist system is the right system and the correct way that society should run. And so it hugely penalises working class people, homeless people and so on. But another example is around casualisation. It is law that if you've worked in a post for more than 4 years, that your post has to be made permanent. And I work for the Ministry of Justice, so I work for the government, and there were people who worked for 14, 15 years in the same post who were still temporary, who still had that hanging over their heads. And the reality is that it can be law, but who enforces the law? When the law is not followed, you've got to have the power to be able to enforce it, and that power is through mass movements. And so, we've always got to kind of link whatever these struggles, whether it's the struggles of the UCU staff, whether it's the struggles of the Grunwick strikers, they are struggling against capitalism. It may be the instance of struggling against a particular employer, but it is ultimately because of the way the capitalist system works. And under the capitalist system, the legal system still works, and every struggle to change that and to change terms and conditions at work has to be won by the working class and by mass mobilisation. And the realities of the trade union movement is wherever you get a force that a leadership have come to the rise to the top of a organisation and that has power in society, then of course that is going to introduce the ability, the sort of them being around a different circle, different layer in society with different privileges, and so on. And so that's why we always fight for the demands of the right to recall of anybody in an elected position, whether that's a political party or whether that is in a trade union, but also the taking of the average wage of somebody you represent. So there's no financial gain to be had by being an elected representative. And so there are certain things that we can fight to introduce, and that's why we fight and put forward the idea of mandatory reselection in the Labour Party, so that this kind of 500,000 people who join the Labour Party because of socialist policies of Jeremy Corbyn can then have the ability to transform that organisation. But I also think that it's not just a case of if you have bad leadership of the TEC and the trade union movement, which I agree we did in the 70s and we do now, although it's not uniform. The force that will change things is the kind of massive anger that you see in society, people angry at austerity, angry at zero contracts and casualisation, at low pay, at massive personal debt burdens, the housing crisis. And yet the Panama Papers, the Paradise Papers, the constant scandals of cash for questions and expense scandals from MPs and those at the top of society, and that anger and that being forced to fight against the exploitative capitalist system is what will break through the kind of bureaucracies that are crystallised at the top of the union movement and other workers' organisations. And as socialists, if we can put forward a programme of how workers can do that, how can we introduce democratic demands and fight for the things that can change these organisations, but also linking that to the need to change society, that this isn't, one battle, this is about fighting to get rid of the capitalist system and fight for socialism, then we will be able to do that.